Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with David Cook and Brent Thomason, co editors of a brand new book that presents case studies of how one major university has integrated faith and learning in the classroom and throughout the entire campus. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we are honored to have as our guests this week David Cook and Brent Thomason. Both are faculty members at Dallas Baptist University. And in addition to teaching in the classroom, David is also an attorney with DBU, and Brent is the dean of the Graduate School of Ministry. And they've recently co-authored a book titled Integrating Faith and Learning: Case Studies from Dallas Baptist University, which I've had the privilege and honor of reading, which is what kind of led up to scheduling this podcast. They did a tremendous job of collecting the stories around DBU. And we're going to talk about that, of how DBU has really taken this whole issue of faith integration beyond the classroom and into many aspects of the function of the student experience on their campus. And so I've brought them in to have a conversation about that, as to what their story has been and how it can apply to a lot of our listeners. So David and Brent, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So before we get into some of the questions that we've talked about before, just so our audience can get to know each of you a little bit better, talk to us about a defining moment, each of you, that God used in your life that, as you reflect back, I think a lot of us have many defining moments, but share with us one of those that God used to propel you to where you are today in either your personal or your professional life. We'll start with Brent, and then we'll go to David.
Yeah, thanks. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be on the show. And I think about my personal life. There's been many little things along the way for the professional life, but for the personal life, I think there's fewer than a handful of instances where I've just defined my faith and my life. And it actually pertains to the birth of our firstborn, Ben. And, we had experienced a miscarriage before Ben came along. And then when Ben came along, things were rocking and rolling. We went to the hospital and we thought things were okay until my wife's began the labor process. I guess the water broke, and all of a sudden our room got really crowded with a lot of nurses, and one of which jumped up on the bed with my wife, and I heard prep the OR and call the doctor. And I thought, this does not sound normal, although I didn't really have a lot of experience to go from. And essentially what had happened is that my wife's cord prolapsed and oxygen levels were quickly diminishing for our son. And so a nurse threw some scrubs at me and told me to get dressed. And I'm silly. I went into the bathroom there, and I was unrobing and throwing on my scrubs. I didn't realize I needed to just throw them on top of me. And in short, when I walked out, they had already wheeled her out, and I was not able to go into the operating room with them. They told me quickly what was going on. And I remember, Philip, just as the nurse walked out of the room, I literally broke out in an ugly cry, we might say, and fell to my knees, because I thought, the two people I care about the most, I am helpless, and the Lord could take one, if not both, because I didn't quite understand what was happening, and kind of had the Job moment, crying out to the Lord. And I felt like in that moment, it was a critical question of either you are going to trust me with those you hold dear, or you won't. And it wasn't I trust you 75%, Lord, and really hope the doctor nail the other 25%. And thankfully, I'm happy to report that within 8 minutes, they had performed an emergency C-section. Ben, of course, had to go to the NICU, but he emerged, and for all practical purposes, is a normal kid. But that was a defining moment for me. And I think that's what called me to really trust the Lord with everything in my life, especially those that I treasure the most.
And when we talk about biblical integration, faith integration, it's in moments like that, right? That's a reflection of what it means when you integrate elements of what we talk about, what we preach, what we learn about, what we confess. But then when life circumstances come our way, that's where we really see kind of the results of that. But thank you for sharing that story. That's powerful. How about you, David?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the defining things in my life was getting to grow up actually at DBU. My father was president here for 28 years. When I was 5 years old, we came to DBU and really getting to see God grow a university. it was a wonderful institution before, but seeing God bring, infinite number of students that were wanting to follow him, professors and staff who wanted to just help grow this institution, get it out of debt. So while I went off on a sojourn through the law and had a different career, that was a defining moment in my life, because then later on, it led to God calling me back to a Christian college environment. I just grew up seeing the value of how God can change and transform lives in these 4 or 5 or 6 years that we have a student.
Yeah, and I'm sure many of our listeners recognize your last name. Of course, your dad being Gary Cook, and the former president. In the NFL, they often talk about coaching trees of coaches that are discipled under main coaches, right? So in the Christian higher ed world, I see the Gary Cook tree. There are a number of leaders that your
Right.
dad mentored along the way, and to see those leaders now as college presidents themselves is remarkable. And for the little bit of time that I've known him, he's just been a tremendous blessing to me and in my own life, and even how I approach leadership. So that's thanks for sharing that, and thanks for being his son.
Absolutely.
Not like you had any control over that, but
It's been a joy to see how God's moved in his life. So
yeah, that's it. All right, so let's talk about this. Dave, we're going to start with you. Tell us the story behind the story. Why did you and Brent decide to co-edit this book together on faith integration at DBU?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, Brent and I were at our faculty workshops, just kind of the normal thing that we do every year. The theme that year was integration of faith in the classroom. And what we realized was that there were some faculty who really had thought deeply about this and knew exactly how to do this. There were others who just really needed a lot of help. So they had a strong faith. They wanted to share that faith, but knowing how to do it in their discipline was easier said than done sometimes. And so we started to think about it from the faculty element. And then we realized that, and I know we'll get into this later on in the podcast, there are other areas of campus. Those students may spend actually a majority of their time in their dorm rooms, on the athletic fields, in the cafeteria. And so we really wanted to kind of expand it and maybe think, how can we help our, not just people at DBU, but across Christian academia, see the value of integrating faith in every single area of a college campus. So that was kind of the impetus for us. We saw a need, and we hoped to be able to share what some people were doing that were really trendsetters in their areas.
Yeah. So how long ago was that you made that decision?
That was a couple of years ago. So it takes a while to corral that many faculty and staff. We had 25 from across campus that eventually wrote all or a portion of a chapter. And so it was a blessing to work with them, but it took a little bit of time.
Sure, it does, and that's the world of editing something, right? It's you're dependent on other people to submit their work, but that's the hard work of editing. And by the way, to the listeners, in the description of this episode, we're going to put a link in case you're interested in purchasing that book or getting access to it. A definitely powerful book. How about you, Brent? What was kind of going through your mind in the behind the scenes of putting this together?
Sure. David and I actually came on board at DBU in the same year, 2014. And so that's how our paths crossed. And we've been thick friends ever since then. And throughout the time, David is always approaching it from the perspective of, we've got to keep Christ center of everything we do. And so being sort of a background from being a pastor and a minister type to coming alongside David of faith integration from a lawyer, we've done a lot of projects together, and it's been a great ride alongside him. And he's the one that had the genesis of the idea out of that workshop. And I was excited about it because my past, I've been asked in some breakout sessions throughout faculty workshops to lead some of these faith integration. But this time we were going to take it to a whole new level and put the project together. So I was very excited that he invited me along, and I got to be a part of the project.
Yeah. Brent, one of the things I have been around higher education, Christian higher education, for 3 decades. The two of you, David, you grew up with it. Brent, you've been in it. And I think a generalized observation, there are obviously, there's always exceptions, but historically, we've had conversations around faith integration, biblical integration, and a lot of great works out there from a theological or from an ideological perspective. And yet we struggle with the implementation of it. It feels like it's a topic that we can talk about, but when it actually comes
Mm.
time to doing faith integration, we get stuck. Why is that?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think there can be many responses to that. I think in my personal experience, starting back in 2014 and being invited to do these sort of sub breakout sessions with our faculty to have conversations about faith integration, one of the first thing I realized is I feel that sometimes faculty make it a bit more complicated than it really is. And one of the questions that I guess I pushed back on and said, well, did you become a teacher first or a Christian first? And most of our professors here obviously were Christians before they ever became a teacher. And then obviously they're Christians coming to DBU. And so I pushed back and said, well, don't you just live out your Christianity naturally and weave faith into the daily rhythms of going grocery shopping or whatever it might be? So then let that be spotlighted, let that be highlighted in the classroom. Because some of the people were saying, well, I don't have a seminary degree like you do, Brent, and I don't have commentaries like you do. And I found my job just trying to make it less complicated and less stressful, just getting back to the basics of you are a person of faith. When you have conversations in class and stories, weave faith, allow faith to be illuminated in that classroom. So I think we make it more complex. And as a result, maybe that stymies us or paralyzes us with fear for actually bringing a full-fledged integration into the classroom. But I think another reason is we're just, as academicians, we're a product of the academy. When I think of our College of Education friends, most of them came out of the public school system already teaching to then receive professorship positions here. And all their professional career, they've been told you can't broach the subject of faith unless it's initiated by the student, unless it's a side conversation in the hall, but not something that is intentionally woven into the fabric of the curriculum itself. I think of our counseling department and our chaplaincy department, very comparable sort of government or licensure restrictions on them that they can't broach the subject, but if it is brought up, then they can work with that wet clay. And so I think as being a result of a product of our different backgrounds, we might not be positioned with the mindset to bring the faith proactively into the material, even though we operate as Christians. So it's kind of overcoming that and reacclimating to this culture. And then, to be honest, Phil, the last thing is, I think we have to be more intentional, and sometimes that intentionality is lacking. Like you said, we talk about our Christian faith, but when we're in the classroom, have we taken time to think in advance about the specific curriculum and about specific verses or about specific life situations where God proved to be faithful, and therefore introduce at those critical moments those stories and Bible verses? And that takes some planning in advance. And I think that may be another reason, or at least is a reason I've experienced interacting with folks, that we may not just have the proactive steps in place before the lecture in order to be.
I love how you said that we're products of we're all products of higher education, earning our doctorates in very specific areas. And I think you highlighted one aspect of it. Another aspect of it too is there's a sense of feeling like my lane is the specialty in which I was trained. I got my doctorate in educational administration, and organizational theory is just my thing, right? And if I step outside of that or go into another discipline, who am I to do that? Because that's not where my terminal degree is. And I think sometimes there's not a fear factor, it's like a respect factor, or kind of like you said, hey, Brent, you went through the formal training. I didn't have that formal training. Who am I to actually integrate, the word of God or
Right.
faith into my discipline when I don't even have the formal training myself? And that's where I think we as leaders at colleges and universities need to step in, because there's validity to that. So then what are we doing to help our faculty members actually engage and say, no, you know what, it's critical to our curriculum that you do bring it. And look, we're not asking you to be a scholar. We're just asking you to bring those elements, and we'll educate you along the way and help you understand how you can bring some of those pieces together. And that's what you all are doing, and doing very well. David, any reflections from your seat on this question?
Yeah, I think I'll echo what Brent said. I think having been a lawyer who's licensed, you have to think differently whenever you're getting this message that's just pummeled at you from the world. You have to say again, I'm a Christian first. I'm a citizen of heaven, and that's where my when I fly my flag, and I'm talking to students about the law, I have to think about it differently. And I think the last thing that Brent shared, the intentionality, I think is sometimes that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this book. We wanted people to have an opportunity to read and think a little more deeply about their discipline. We hope that this will be used in other universities and in our universities as maybe some opportunities for faculty in the sciences to sit around and say, hey, how do we do this? Or mathematics, or even in physical operations on a college campus. How can we think deeply about, man, these people right in front of us are made in the image of God. That really should change how we treat them, the ethics behind how I cross-examine a witness and how I teach my students to cross-examine a witness. So thinking intentionally is where we were hoping to go with this book.
Yeah. Well, job well done. And David, the one piece I really like about this book, because I've seen a lot that's written on faith integration and biblical integration, and it's almost exclusively written from the perspective of the classroom, the curriculum, disciplines, what the students are learning in their scope and sequence of a 4-year undergraduate degree or even to a graduate degree. So it's all focused on the classroom experience, which is paramount. It's important. That's the product. That's what students are enrolling for to get that degree. But your book says, wait a second, it's a little bit broader here. It's not just the classroom experience. So why did you take it that step further?
Well, I'm a big believer that God cares about every square inch of our life, to use that quote from Kuyper. And so if he cares about every square inch of our lives, then he cares about every square inch of our campuses. And conversely, every square inch of our campuses can be a mission field. DBU, we have hundreds of students a year who come to us from, we have I think a little over 600 students right now who are international students. About half of whom at least come, and we know that they're not Christian. We don't require a signed statement of faith. And so we feel like we've got a mission field right here on our campus. The professor who sits down in the cafeteria and mentors that student in that physical space, that is a beautiful opportunity. And that wouldn't exist without having that dining facility on campus. So how can even our physical operations staff think about that dining facility as a place where ministry can happen and where conversations about Jesus can happen? One of the things that I loved as I was talking to the guys who wrote that chapter is we all kind of keyed in on the fact that Jesus himself ate, and he used the medium of food to break down barriers. And so how can we see our Chick-fil-A on campus and our dining facilities as extensions of the ministry that occurs in the classroom? Maybe that student is hearing the faith integration in the classroom and it sinks in on some level, but maybe it's their RA, maybe it's their coach, maybe it's a professor who's mentoring them on their off time. And so I wanted to show that this has to be something that we think about, not just for faculty, but for the entire faculty and staff at a university.
Yeah. It's an interesting perspective, especially as and you know this from being an attorney, some of the court cases that have challenged on some of our campuses, that whether you're considered in religious work or not religious work, there's this dichotomy of, physical plant staff, well, they're not performing a ministerial function, or the cafeteria workers, or some of the people in student development. This dichotomy of, well, there are those who are responsible for it, and then there are others that aren't responsible for it. This kind of unifies it together to say, wait a second, we're Christ followers first, and we have a mandate to go and make disciples regardless of what job we have. And God has given you an opportunity on a campus to be able to minister to students from A to Z, from their entire college experience. And, if you count up the time that those students are with faculty versus when they're with other students, coaches, RAs, DAs, resident directors, whatever else, actually the academic portion is a small percentage of the overall over a 4-year period. So that much more critical to make sure that this idea of faith integration, biblical integration, happens across the spectrum of the entire student experience.
Yeah, our staff are such an integral part of what we do and what happens at every Christian college. And so we wanted to just highlight the good work that they're doing to be able to really take a deep dive with those students on on growing them spiritually and creating faith.
Yeah.
If I can jump in there, David focused on the staff, and that is, I mean, that's who we are. When we talk about DBU, we really talk about the people and the transformational experience that they're experiencing. So when we talk about the staff, and then we also talk about the space, and that honestly, it was through this book process that I began to have my eyes illuminated to all the places on campus where we are intentional about the space through the physical operations guy and the landscaping guys about creating spaces for spiritual reflection, for scripture to be read. One example that we list in the book is that we positioned 3 crosses down by a new part of the campus development. And then the physical operations guys rerouted the existing fitness trail to pass by those crosses and create some benches for prayer and reflection with Bible verses listed on the trail. And so that's just a great explanation of how we're utilizing not just the staff as an extension of the mission and what's happening in the classroom, but we're utilizing the space so that those themes are reiterated and put before them once again. So it just comes back to a holistic transformation. That's what we're about, not just in the classroom, but beyond as well.
And to the casual observer, one could say, well, those are, I mean, that's such a little thing, but it's not. It's reinforcing visually. And if ever you get a chance, if any of our listeners get a chance to be in the Dallas area, it's worth a trip to DBU to just drive the campus, because there's just so much intentionality that this is a Christ-centered university. This is the core of what we do. And it's reflected in everything, even on the sidewalks and the running trails and some of the statues that are there, some of the plaques that are there. You know, on the backside of the sign, there are messages that reinforce. And I kind of referenced it before, and it's the culture in which we live, this dichotomy of we live our secular life and we live our spiritual life. And we assume when students come onto our college campus that they're connecting the dots, that what they're learning in the classroom, it's applying to everything that they're experiencing. And nothing could be further from the truth. It has to be modeled for them. And I think they're hungry and thirsty for that modeling. They're wanting that in their life. And what a golden opportunity we have on our campuses to be able to actually do that. And the book does a great job of explaining it. It's not like you all have arrived and you figured it all out, but it's just finding ways to just continually reinforce that biblical or faith integration on your campus. David, talk to us about what some of the risks may be to some of you're an attorney, you see this. What are some of the risks if we're not intentional? I mean, our motivation obviously is because we're Christ followers, but there could be some risks if on our campuses, we do kind of have that dichotomy. What are some of those risks?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, what we've seen in our nation is that there were so many schools that were started with that deep Christian commitment. And, I think of places like Harvard and Yale, but so many of even our originally Baptist institutions or some of our Presbyterian Methodist, no matter which denomination started them, there are so many of those that have drifted over time. And what a sad thing to have left the very mission that was the core of why you started the organization and the institution in the first place. And so one of the things that I'm a big believer of is that mission drift happens slowly and is kind of like a riptide unless you fight against it, your institution. And so one of the things that we want to do is to encourage conversations on campus, and not just at DBU. We hope that this will be a resource at other institutions for them to have conversations with their faculty, their staff, to think, how are we being intentional about this? It isn't just going to happen on its own. And so if we don't want our institution to drift in that same way that some of the colleges that came a few hundred years before us did, how can we let Christ infuse everything we do? And so secondly, we're facing a lot of legal challenges as Christian institutions. Over the next 20 years, I think there will be a continuing barrage of different challenges. And so I think it's one of the best things that we can do to prepare is to know exactly where we stand, who we are, whose we are, and how we're going to operate in a way that's not, we're not angry about it. We're not trying to, it's not Christ against culture, but it's Christ transforming culture, to use that analogy from Niebuhr's book. How can we on our campuses really think intentionally now about exactly where we stand, so that when the legal challenges come, we already can say, this is how we have always operated. This is who we are. And so I think those are a couple of challenges that come to mind for me.
Yeah, yeah. And we're all aware recently the Department of Education did some additional rulemaking related to Title IX. And the good news in the mix of all of that is the religious exemption remains intact in Title IX. However, if you've read some of the conversation around it, really challenging, okay, what you have to be really religious in order to claim this religious exemption. It can't just be something, well, we've got Christian in our name, therefore that somehow exempts us from aspects of Title IX. I remember years ago in my doctoral studies at Temple University in the law class, there was a Supreme Court case, I think, along the way that produced a three-pronged test for pervasively religious institutions. And it was things like required chapel and a religious mission and a set of required, Bible or religious courses. So even there, recognizing the fact at the government level to say, wait a second, you can't just be in name. It actually has to somehow permeate aspects of what you do. And so from a it's almost like a proactive approach. Not that that's your motivation, right? But it's part of it to be able to say, no, you know what? We're establishing the fact that we are a Christ-centered university, and these are all of the ways that we can demonstrate that. And I know for Adam Wright, your president, one of the reasons of connecting in with ABHE revolves around that, to say, okay, this is what we're telling the public, and we want to be able to say that from an external perspective, ABHE is able to validate the fact that we keep the main thing on our campus. And that's it's fascinating, the conversations we're having around this. Well, listen, we're getting to the last couple of minutes, so I want to give each of you just an opportunity, and we're going to start with you, Brent, as a faculty member, as an academic leader at DBU. What's just one message of encouragement that you'd like to pass along to our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. I'll hijack the Nike slogan. Just do it. Just get in the classroom, be secure, be firm in your Christianity, and give it a go. Sometimes things at first, any kind of sort of new rhythm in life, it takes some more intentionality at first. But then after a while, it just becomes the fabric of who you are. And so I would just be encouraging anyone, let your Christianity, let your faith be on display, show how you're operating as a Christian in everything you can do. You can't check your Christianity at the door when you walk into the classroom. So just find ways to illuminate that.
I love it. Thanks, Brent. How about you, David?
Speaking of that theme of illumination, if Jesus tells us to go be salt and light, then let's do it in the classroom. Let's do it in the cafeteria. Let's find unique ways on our college campuses to make sure that every staff member, every faculty member is just equipped to not just think intentionally, but be ready to be equipped to do integration in a broad variety of ways. So my goal with the book is I hope that it will lead to good conversations with lots of different campuses all across America.
Yeah. Well said. And we know from the book of James, chapter 1, I believe it is, or chapter 3, I might be getting them confused. But those of us who are teachers that are called to teach are held to a greater level of accountability. So the things that we've talked about isn't just nice things or, gee, it would be great if you could. There's actually a level of accountability that one day our Heavenly Father will pull us aside and say, hey, I gave you that gift of teaching, and I told you I'd be holding you to a higher level of accountability with this. How did you actually use that? And there'll be a day of reckoning, I do believe. But what an opportunity for us to use our lives the way God has created us to influence this next generation. There's a lot of pessimism out there, but I am so incredibly optimistic because of what's happening on the DBU campus, what's happening across 163 other campuses who are ABHE institutions. I am hopeful for this next generation. So, guys, thank you for contributing to the bigger picture of everything that we're doing. And thank you for being part of the show.
Thank you, Philip. And we appreciate ABHE and all that y'all are doing.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I mentioned before, we'll definitely put in the show description a link so that you can go out and get that book. And we trust that it will be something of value for your campus as well as other faculty members where you serve. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.